Hello there. Tonight we are going to slip back in time, not gently, not romantically, but headfirst into a world where your most private business was everyone's business. Picture this, a cold stone courtroom, high windows letting in only gray light, and a man trembling beneath the weight of expectations so ancient and so absurd, you almost want to step in and tell him he can leave. But he can't. His dignity, his marriage, his property, his entire standing in this tiny medieval town hangs by a thread. That thread is currently being examined by three stern-looking men in official robes. You probably won't survive medieval intimacy culture. Not the expectations, not the scrutiny, not the endless layers of humiliation stacked neatly like pewter cups on a banquet table. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Post your location and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. It wasn't just kings and queens who had to put their love lives on public display. Ordinary people, too, found their most personal challenges becoming matters of legal debate. Imagine your spouse angry, bitter, perhaps just bored, marching down to the local magistrate to accuse you not of theft, not of slander, but of failing to perform. Yes, perform. In bed. And not even privately. These trials were known by many names across Europe, but they shared one horrifying purpose: to determine whether you were physically capable of fulfilling your marital duties. In modern terms, think less family court and more terrifying live demonstration. The courts weren't content with whispered testimonies or blushing denials. They wanted proof, and they had their ways of getting it. Take poor John Sanderson of York, 1370. His case still survives in brittle ink on yellowed parchment. His wife accused him of impotence after 3 years of an unconsummated marriage, and the court agreed to a formal examination. The examiners were midwives, physicians, and priests certified by the crown or church to declare whether a man was up to the task. They wore badges, they kept notebooks, they kept a schedule. Sanderson was marched pale and silent into a special chamber. Not a medical room, a courtroom annex. Stone floors, benches for the observers, a raised platform because humiliation always looks better from a few feet up. The tests weren't gentle. Stimulation methods were prescribed in ancient texts involving warmth oils, sometimes even crude devices meant to mimic arousal. And all of this took place under the watchful gaze of notaries scribbling down notes like "no visible change." Subject distressed. Wife weeping. It sounds absurd, now quaint, even in its barbarity. But then, this was serious. This was about property, reputation, lineage. A man who failed could be stripped of his marriage, his dowry, his honor. A woman could reclaim her fortune, her family's standing. A failed body meant failed contracts. Historians still debate whether these trials were more common in certain regions, or simply better documented where bureaucracy thrived. Failure didn't come quietly. Some men tried multiple times, weeks apart, consuming dangerous potions between attempts. Pierre de Franville of Paris, 1450, succeeded only after taking so many herbs. He likely shaved years off his life. Others fainted on the examination table from the sheer weight of shame. Witnesses noted tears, trembling, even prayers whispered to saints who seemed conspicuously absent. But why such scrutiny? Why this fixation on proof? Because marriage back then wasn't romance. It was contract. It was economy. It was survival. A marriage without consummation was void legally, spiritually, financially. Entire estates hung in the balance. If a man couldn't produce heirs, land couldn't pass cleanly. Families couldn't merge wealth. Alliances fractured. And let's not forget, the church looming large with its tangled doctrines. Sex was sin, yes, but also sacrament. A union without it offended God's plan. Canon law inherited from Rome allowed annulments in cases of permanent incapacity. This wasn't merely tolerated, it was prescribed. A bishop might refuse a confession if you hadn't done your duty. Doctors offered their own bizarre wisdom steeped in humor theory and ancient Greek nonsense. An imbalance of bile, they said, could render a man impotent. Too much cold air, too many cold foods, the wrong kind of astrology. Treatment involved warm baths, vigorous exercise, and optimism. Failing that well, there were always the trials. Records show these courts flourished most in cities where medicine and law collided: London, Paris, Florence. Over 200 cases per decade in some places. Success under 30%. Which means most men walked away disgraced. Families unraveled. Alliances crumbled. Dowries returned like damaged goods. Modern marriage counseling seems almost laughably kind by comparison. One odd fact, amid all this cruelty, women had rights. Not modern rights, mind you, but rights nonetheless. A woman could demand satisfaction, and the court would listen. A wife's unhappiness wasn't her fault if her husband's body failed her. This tiny sliver of agency gleamed darkly amid the oppression. Of course, there were frauds, schemes, performances rigged to succeed or fail as needed, examiners bribed, witnesses coerced, herbalists paid handsomely for temporary if painful results. Rumors circulated of secret techniques involving needles, heated cloths, and alarming levels of shame. Whether these worked is another matter entirely. The psychological torture outstripped the physical. Imagine standing half-naked, surrounded by strangers, being asked to perform something deeply private, while a scribe notes your every twitch. No wonder some men collapsed. Some never returned to their homes, their reputations so shattered they vanished into monasteries or distant villages. And yet life went on. Trials concluded. Verdicts delivered. Couples separated or reconciled under new terms. The town moved on to the next scandal, the next festival, the next plague. But for those men and women who lived through it, the memory must have lingered a shadow on every subsequent touch, every whispered promise. Privacy as we cherish it now simply did not exist. Your body was evidence, your bedroom a courtroom, your worth measured in moments you couldn't control. And this was only the beginning. Because if you thought courtrooms were intrusive, just wait until you see what happened on your wedding night. So here's where things get even stranger, because medieval medicine wasn't just concerned with broken bones or plague sores. It had a deep vested interest in what went on between married couples in the bedroom. Or rather, what didn't. If you failed to perform, if your wife failed to conceive, the problem wasn't private. It was a matter for doctors, midwives, priests, and sometimes even your neighbors to debate, diagnose, and of course attempt to fix. And their methods, well, let's just say they lacked subtlety. According to the best medical minds of the day, men trained in the hallowed halls of Paris, Bologna, or Salerno. A woman could not conceive unless she experienced satisfaction. Not some vague notion of marital duty fulfilled, but literal, physical, undeniable pleasure. Without it, her body wouldn't release its seed, and without seed from both partners, no child could be formed. This wasn't some fringe belief whispered among village healers. It was accepted science taught in universities, written in textbooks, debated in Latin. The great physician Galen, who'd been dead for over 1,000 years, still held sway over medical theory. His ideas about two seeds meeting inside the womb continued to shape how medieval Europe thought about sex reproduction and marital obligations. The result: doctors prescribing pleasure, seriously. Midwives became unlikely experts in technique. They weren't just delivering babies, they were instructing couples on how to make them properly. If a marriage remained childless, a midwife might be called to the house not with herbs or prayers, but with practical demonstrations. On cloth models, of course. Usually, there were manuals too. The Trotula, a wildly popular compilation of women's medical knowledge, offered detailed instructions on positions techniques, even foreplay, designed to ensure a woman reached her necessary peak. Cold-natured women required warmth and stimulation. Hot-natured women needed cooling and gentleness. Moist women, dry women, tilted wombs, all accounted for, with precise recommendations that would make modern gynecologists raise an eyebrow. Historians still debate whether this emphasis on female satisfaction made medieval medicine strangely progressive or just deeply confused. After all, the theories were laughably wrong, but the attention to female pleasure that wouldn't resurface in mainstream medicine for centuries, and the tools of the trade ingenious, disturbing, sometimes both. Doctors recommended warming devices, smooth polished implements of ivory or wood meant to encourage arousal, herbal oils infused with cinnamon peppermint, massages tailored to stimulate the humors. Even music was prescribed, certain rhythms believed to awaken the sleeping passions of reluctant wives. One odd fact: physicians believed feathers were excellent diagnostic tools. Tickling certain areas supposedly revealed sensitivity or the lack thereof. Heated probes came next, because nothing says romance like medical-grade discomfort. If a woman responded, her condition was hopeful. If not, the treatments grew more aggressive. And what of the men? They were prescribed vigor, strength, exercise, warm baths infused with rosemary and thyme. Foods thought to encourage virility: ginger, garlic, figs, honey. The occasional aphrodisiac, though medieval options ranged from mildly spicy to downright toxic. Failure to satisfy wasn't just embarrassing. It was a breach of contract. A husband unable or unwilling to please his wife risked annulment lawsuits, even excommunication. Marriage was duty. Duty meant heirs. Heirs meant nations survived. The church predictably tied itself in knots over this. Pleasure was sinful, except when it wasn't. Enjoying it too much marked you as a libertine. Enjoying it too little might doom your immortal soul, or at least your lineage. Confessors faced impossible questions: should they chastise women for faking pleasure to avoid intimacy, or for failing to enjoy it enough to conceive? Some manuals advised priests to inquire directly about the success of a husband's efforts. Delicately, one hopes. Behind closed doors, a shadow economy of knowledge flourished. Midwives taught what priests condemned. Convents housed not just nuns, but medical texts disguised as devotional works. Women shared secrets in whispers: herbs, oils, positions, timings. They passed down knowledge their daughters might one day need, couched in language of fertility, not desire. Medical texts contained recipes as elaborate as they were dangerous. Ground pearls mixed with wine. Tinctures of mandrake root, potions of honey, and powdered exotic seeds. Wealthy women spent fortunes on carved jade implements, pearl-studded accessories, even primitive irrigation devices. All in pursuit of conception, disguised as cure. One case survives in court. Records a merchant's wife, barren for 3 years, treated with daily massages, warming oils, special diets, heavy on ginger and cinnamon. After 2 months, she conceived. Success was attributed not to love, but to proper medical intervention. Physicians developed instruments, early speculums, hollow tubes, to amplify sounds, devices to gauge warmth and moisture. They didn't understand what they measured, but measure they did. Diagnosis became performance art, healing an odd mixture of science and superstition. Historians still debate whether these practices empowered women or merely trapped them in another web of expectation. A woman might seek help, but help came wrapped in judgment. Too much desire made you suspect. Too little made you defective. Oddest of all, this obsession with pleasure laid the groundwork for later repression. The Victorians, with their fainting couches and hysteria diagnoses, erased centuries of acknowledgement with a sniff and a lace handkerchief. Women, they declared, didn't want or need pleasure. Doctors who disagreed faced scandal, but in medieval Europe at least, no one doubted its necessity. They just wrapped it in theology, coded it in humoral theory, and sold it as medical fact. The practical impact on women's lives was immense. Annulments granted, marriages restored, lawsuits settled, all because someone finally admitted what she wanted or didn't. Records show women citing lack of satisfaction as grounds for annulment boldly, publicly. Husbands instructed to improve or face consequences, and yet behind every prescription lay the darker side of medieval medicine, the desperate, the dangerous, the downright deadly. For if satisfying your husband brought pressure, avoiding his children brought peril. And in that peril, medieval women turned to methods so horrifying they make the worst old wives' tales look like bedtime stories. In medieval Europe, if you were caught in an affair, your punishment wasn't whispered gossip or a passive-aggressive silence at family gatherings. No, the consequences were public. They were humiliating. They were brutal in a way that only a society obsessed with controlling bodies and shaming desire could invent. Forget modern scandals splashed across tabloids or hashtags trending on social media. The medieval answer to adultery was lay course, the run, and you weren't running alone. Imagine it's dawn. The church bells are ringing not for prayer, but to summon the entire town to witness your shame. You and your lover stand naked in the square, surrounded by officials in robes, townsfolk with baskets of rotten vegetables, children eager for spectacle, and old women gripping willow switches with a glint of satisfaction in their eyes. A rope is tied around your lover's waist. You hold the other end like a leash. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. You, woman, seductress, temptress, have led this man astray. Now you lead him through the streets in disgrace. The route is deliberate. Past the church where you married. Through the market where neighbors trade gossip. Around the town well where women draw water and whispers. Past taverns, bakeries, blacksmiths, every place where your face is known, every corner where your shame can be magnified. Historians still debate whether this punishment originated purely from legal codes or from a more ancient pagan sense of communal purification. What's clear is that it served both as spectacle and as deterrent. The crowd was not passive. They participated. They were part of the punishment. Rotten produce was hurled, chamber pots emptied, whips cracked. The strongest blows came not from officials, but from those closest to the wronged spouse relatives wielding switches with practiced malice. Each neighborhood had its own stations of suffering stopping points where the humiliation deepened. Special humiliations might be performed at certain landmarks, kneeling in the dirt, forced declarations of guilt, more blows delivered with ceremonial flair. One odd fact. Some towns had specific bells reserved solely for adultery punishments. Different tones rang out to signal each stage of the procession: start, stop, punishment, delivered, punishment, completed. The sound alone was enough to draw a crowd. The records from Contraception, Carcassonne in 1347, offer gruesome detail. A merchant's wife and her young clerk lover endured 3 miles of this ordeal. She survived but fled the town in disgrace. He wasn't so lucky. Infection from the waist binding killed him within the week. Toulouse, 1389. A knight caught with a baker's wife. His noble blood offered no shield. His humiliation drew particular relish from a crowd eager to humble those above them. He survived, but his injuries ended his military career. No more horses, no more campaigns, just the memory of that rope biting into his flesh. Mortality rates were shocking for something labeled as punishment, not execution. Between 30 to 40% of men died from infections caused by the rope. Women fared better, but still bore scars, physical, social, psychological. Some took their own lives before the run could claim them. Others vanished into exile, their names cursed in songs and stories long after their bodies disappeared. The symbolism was potent. The woman leading the man illustrated her unnatural dominance through lust. The man led like an animal, displayed how desire reduced him to beast. Gender roles enforced with cruelty and cords. Yet punishment was not always equal. Women often faced permanent exile while men might slink back into grudging acceptance. The economic ramifications mattered. Adultery disrupted inheritance lines. Threatened family businesses cast doubt on paternity. This was theft of the highest order, not of money, but of bloodlines and legacy. The community's involvement wasn't just spectacle, it was purification. Adultery was seen as a pollution of the social body. Everyone had to participate in expelling it. Each lash, each jeer, each thrown vegetable reaffirmed the moral boundaries of the town. Oddly, these punishments varied wildly by region. Southern France and parts of Italy favored the rope and run. England leaned towards pillories and stocks, less mobile but equally degrading. German towns, shaved heads, tarred faces paraded offenders on donkeys facing backwards. All shared the goal: public humiliation restored order. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these rituals. Did they curb adultery? Records suggest not. Rates remained steady. But the course served other purposes: communal bonding through shared violence, a release valve for simmering tensions, reinforcement of marriage as both contract and cage. Over time, the punishments evolved. By the 1500s, the rope was less common. Processions became symbolic rather than violent. Adulterers paraded in dunce caps, forced to wear signs detailing their crimes. Bells rang, crowds gathered, but bloodshed diminished. Slowly, yet public shaming lingered. Even into the modern era, parading the fallen remained a favored pastime. Twitter mobs may not wield whips, but they trade in humiliation just as efficiently. Hashtags replace rope. Screenshots replace rotten eggs. The impulse is the same. Still, psychological scars often outlast physical ones. Survivors of lay course bore not just bruises, but the weight of community scorn etched into their memories, whispered behind their backs, carried like invisible shackles for life. One wonders if any lay awake at night, replaying every step, every jeer, every blow, wishing they'd been more careful, more discreet, or simply born in a time less obsessed with controlling flesh through spectacle. But control was the point. Control was everything. And in a world where sex, love, and loyalty were public matters, privacy was a fantasy no one could afford. When desperation met desire in the medieval world, women turned to something even stranger than mercury or lead. They turned to magic. Not the harmless sort of fairy tale magic with glass slippers and fairy godmothers. This was a far grittier, darker business. This was love magic. And it trafficked in ingredients you wouldn't want anywhere near your dinner table. Forget flowers and sweet words. Medieval romance, at its most desperate, demanded bone marrow from infants' hair plucked during intimacy, menstrual blood slipped into wine, and organs purchased from the executioner's assistant. Love was not blind. It was unspeakably grim. The recipes came from everywhere. Ancient Roman texts whispered folk traditions, half-remembered spells from grimoires passed hand to hand under threat of excommunication. Beatrice de Anosol, Of 1320, France stood trial for feeding her lover wine spiked with her menstrual blood. She wasn't alone. Dozens of similar cases pepper the legal records across Europe from Venice to London to Montpellier. These weren't fringe practices by a few eccentric women. They were survival strategies in a world where a woman's future hinged on securing a husband, keeping a lover faithful, or restoring a wandering man to her bed. And when charm and beauty failed, when status offered no protection, women turned to the grave. Corpse parts held immense power. Children's bones, especially from those who died unbaptized, were prized. Bone marrow had to be harvested within days of burial, 3 at most, using heated needles to extract the precious essence before it soured. This marrow would be dried ground, mixed with honey and wine, then administered secretly over weeks. The goal, to bind the heart, to cloud the mind, to create a love so fierce it couldn't escape. Executioners made tidy profits, selling human organs from freshly hanged criminals. Hearts, livers, bits of brain, carefully dried, powdered, mixed with herbs like vervain and mandrake. These concoctions didn't just promise affection, they promised obsession, and if used unwisely, madness or death. Hair carried special significance. Collected during intimacy, woven into charms, burned with specific incenses, or sewn into secret pockets. The best hair was taken without the man's knowledge. After all, the power lay partly in deceit. Some spells required braiding the hair of both lovers together, binding them symbolically and supposedly spiritually. Menstrual blood was considered the most potent ingredient of all. Collected in secret, dried into cakes, stirred fresh into stews, poured into wine. Some recipes specified the phase of the moon. Others demanded mixtures of blood with bodily fluids from both partners, mingling essences to create an irresistible bond. The rituals often involved crossroads, graveyards, churchyards, places where boundaries blurred between life and death. And the spells, not elegant Latin or lyrical poetry, but guttural chants cobbled together from misunderstood fragments of scripture and ancient nonsense. One surviving grimoire offers this gem. Pervis visa mortui per sanguine menstrum, lia coromantis. Roughly through the sight of the dead and menstrual blood, bind the lover. Women who couldn't read memorized these phonetically, often mangling them beyond recognition. It didn't matter. The power was said to lie in the ritual, not the accuracy. Timing mattered. New moon for binding, full moon for attraction. Ingredients gathered under the wrong phase were considered useless or dangerous. Mixing had to happen at specific sites. Crossroads for confusion, churchyards for authority, bedchambers for potency. Some rituals required the woman to be naked. Others insisted she wear the man's clothing. Every step laden with symbolism. The dosages were disturbingly precise. Too little, and the target remained indifferent. Too much, and they risked madness, illness, or sudden death. Women kept records, adjusting their mixtures over time like apothecaries refining poisons. Some became known for their skill, selling their services discreetly to those too afraid or too poor to attempt magic alone. Punishments varied wildly. Noble women might face exile or penance. Peasant women, execution. London courts recorded dozens of cases yearly. Venice uncovered entire networks selling standardized potions. Augsburg once forced convicted women to drink their own concoctions publicly. A punishment both humiliating and occasionally fatal. Historians still debate whether these potions truly worked. Some argue the placebo effect combined with relentless suggestion could produce real changes in behavior. Men believed they'd been bewitched and acted accordingly, hearts racing, thoughts clouded, desires sharpened by fear. Others fell ill, whether from the potion or coincidence. One odd fact, many ingredients had genuine medical uses. Dove's blood treated epilepsy. Bone marrow helped joint pain. This overlap let women obtain materials under false pretenses. An apothecary couldn't know his dove brains weren't destined for a headache cure, and the church officially, all magic was condemned. Unofficially, priests sold blessed candles and holy water for love rituals. Some monasteries gained reputations for effectiveness in matters of the heart, less through divine intervention than through whispered knowledge passed between confessors and penitents. The difference between male and female practitioners is telling. Men, if caught, were branded magicians, learned dangerous but respected. Women were witches subverting the natural order, threatening male authority through unsanctioned power. The motivations weren't always sinister. Marriage was often the only path to security. A match to a wealthy merchant or minor noble could elevate not just a woman, but her entire family. The risks of exposure, trial, torture, death were weighed against the risks of poverty, loneliness, disgrace. And yet through all this darkness, a thread of humanity winds. The desperate desire to be loved, to keep a home, to hold on to someone slipping away. It's easy to scoff at spells and potions, but the fear and hope beneath them are eternal. Modern dating apps seem almost laughably benign in comparison. At worst, you risk heartbreak or embarrassment, not grave-robbing poisoning or public execution. But the impulse, the ache for connection, the terror of loneliness, the lengths to which we'll go to bind another heart to our own, that hasn't changed. Not in 1,000 years. And when love turned sour, when passion betrayed medieval justice had its own brutal answer. The wedding was not the end of scrutiny. It was only the beginning. You'd think after surviving a public courtroom evaluation of your abilities, you might be granted a private night to lick your wounds, sip some watered wine, and make the best of a terrible situation. Not so, my friend. Not in medieval Europe. No, your wedding night, especially if you were of noble blood, or worse, royal blood, was not your night at all. It belonged to everyone else. To the priests, the nobles, the in-laws. To the ambassador from some chilly corner of France. To the aunt who'd been eyeing your dowry with suspicion since you first arrived. Witnesses, live, in the room. Not peeking through a keyhole or eavesdropping outside the door. No, they were in the room. Positioned at strategic points like bored extras in a bad play. Some by the bed, some at the door. All straining to hear, to see, to verify. Why? Because politics. Because power. Because without consummation, the marriage wasn't real. Without consummation, alliances crumbled, borders bled, fortunes vanished into the cold ground. Inheritance required proof, and proof required witnesses. Take the case of Margaret of Anjou, married off at the tender age of 15 to King Henry VI of England. A child queen pressed into the service of diplomacy. On her wedding night, no fewer than 23 individuals, nobles, clergy, courtiers, crowded into the royal bedchamber to ensure that England and France were well and truly united. They weren't loitering outside with a cup of wine. They were there, in the room. Curtains drawn, yes, but thin. Ears pressed. Eyes straining through shadows. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself stood at the foot of the bed, blessing the union with the somber dignity of a man pretending not to listen too hard. You can imagine the pressure. You can imagine the performance anxiety. Modern couples struggle with in-laws asking when babies are coming. Imagine your priest waiting to hear you succeed before offering his congratulations. Historians still debate whether these audiences were strictly enforced at every noble wedding or only invoked when the stakes were especially high. But the records don't lie where politics mingled with marriage witnesses followed. The ceremonies before the ceremony weren't much better. Public undressing rituals turned the newlyweds into unwilling actors in a bawdy comedy. The bride's female relatives stripped her down with commentary on her body's supposed readiness for motherhood. The groom's male kin offered unsolicited advice jokes, sometimes even lewd songs while peeling away layers of brocade and silk. Then came the parade. Yes, a literal procession through the halls, through corridors lined with guests, some drunk, some spiteful, all throwing things, all shouting things. Flowers, if you were lucky. Small fruits, if you weren't. Allegedly for fertility. In reality, humiliation in disguise. Once in the chamber there were rituals. Wine mixed with herbs of dubious efficacy. Honey cakes shaped like certain body parts. Oysters, because why not? The bed itself received a blessing, holy water sprinkled over the very sheets meant to bear witness to success. The curtains closed, but not really. Thin cloth. Shadow play. Movement discernible to trained eyes. Strategic positioning of witnesses, some near the bed, others by the door, making sure no one slipped out prematurely. Failure wasn't an option. Not unless you wanted annulments, lawsuits, or worse, war. Catherine of Aragon's infamous wedding to Prince Arthur of England in 1501 involved similar scrutiny. When Arthur emerged the next morning, he famously declared, "I have been in Spain this night," while demanding ale. Decades later, that boast or its veracity would underpin Henry V's entire annulment campaign. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's first night together was no more private. Nobles watched. The Archbishop of Reims blessed. The pressure mounted. The couple failed. Not once, not twice, for not just 7 years. They failed. Publicly, repeatedly. The shame rippled through Versailles like a cracked mirror. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. Some couples collapsed under it. Margaret Tudor, married to the King of Scotland, at age 13, faced Scottish nobles literally demanding to see proof of consummation. The records note that witnesses heard her distress, pain, fear, perhaps horror, at the violation of not just her body, but her very dignity. The next morning brought fresh humiliations. Sheets examined. Blood displayed. Midwives summoned to poke, prod, pronounce. Legal oaths sworn over linen damp with supposed evidence. Notaries scribbled everything down in ink meant to outlive the participants. Testimonies preserved odd details, movement of bed curtains, sounds of exertion, duration of the act. Some witnesses stayed through the night to ensure multiple attempts. Imagine falling asleep under those circumstances. Failure brought immediate consequences. Alliances dissolved overnight. Dowries contested. Succession lines blurred. Wars sparked from such private misfortunes. Kings needed heirs. Nobles needed proof. Families needed closure. Without consummation, none of it counted. French ceremonies leaned into spectacle. More witnesses, more ceremony. English ones preferred the quiet horror of next morning verification. Italians, they often crowded the entire wedding party into the chamber, because why should intimacy be spared the joy of communal observation? Today's awkward wedding speeches feel almost charming by comparison. A tipsy uncle's ill-advised toast pales next to the weight of clergy peering through curtains. Oddly enough, this wasn't just cruelty. It was control. It was law. It was faith. The church insisted marriage wasn't complete without the flesh becoming one. Without witnesses, disputes festered. Heirs demanded certainty. Communities demanded order. Imagine explaining modern honeymoon suites to a medieval bride. Privacy absurd. Intimacy. A luxury for peasants perhaps, but not for those whose wombs bore treaties within them. And so the witnesses watched. The sheets stained. The scribes wrote. The world turned indifferent to the trauma inflicted beneath its tapestries. We've traveled far from those days, at least in practice. But echoes remain. Pressure, expectation, performance. The fear of failure, public or private. These things linger beneath the velvet of modern bedsheets. And while noble couples endured prying eyes for the sake of nations elsewhere, other powers profited from less ceremonious transactions of the flesh. Privacy as we understand it now simply didn't exist in medieval Europe. Not when it came to sex, not when it came to marriage, not when it came to your body, your choices, your most intimate secrets. They weren't yours to keep. They belonged to the community, to the church, to the state, to everyone except you. Your wedding night might begin beneath thin curtains with your parents in attendance, and it might end with your bed linens hung in public as proof of your performance. Your body might be examined by court-appointed officials, prodded and judged in front of scribes, recording every humiliating detail. Your failures could end your marriage, unravel your alliances, return your dowry, destroy your standing. And if you strayed, if passion overcame duty, if loneliness led you astray, if desire spoke louder than your priest, the punishment would be swift. Nakedness, rope, public scorn. A spectacle designed not only to shame but to cleanse because your sin polluted more than your soul. It endangered inheritance, disrupted business, offended God, fractured the fragile lattice of community. The solution wasn't quiet or kind. It was public. It was painful. It was merciless. Historians still debate whether medieval people felt this lack of privacy as keenly as we would now. Did they yearn for closed doors and whispered secrets? Or did they accept exposure as inevitable, as natural, as the turning of seasons or the tolling of bells? Oddly, amid all this spectacle, some found power. Women could demand satisfaction in court. They could refuse to bear children for men who failed them. They could turn to potions, spells, midwives' whispered wisdom, to seize a sliver of control over their own bodies, however dangerous the means. The knowledge passed in secret generation to generation, beneath the noses of priests and husbands alike. But the consequences of failure were staggering. Death from infection, death from poison, death from childbirth repeated until the body broke. Or worse, living on carrying the weight of disgrace marked forever by trials failed or punishments endured. Even those who obeyed the rules lived under scrutiny. Married life was not a sanctuary. The church demanded proof of unity. The state demanded heirs. The neighbors demanded propriety. There were no locks sturdy enough to keep out the gaze of others. Your desires, your fears, your failures, all were matters of public concern. And above it all loomed the church, preaching purity, profiting from vice, condemning pleasure, prescribing it as medicine, selling indulgences to cleanse your soul while building cathedrals with the wages of sin. The hypocrisy was vast, institutionalized, worn like a second robe atop vestments already heavy with contradiction. The line between public and private simply wasn't drawn. Your body was not your own. It was evidence. It was currency. It was a battlefield for theology, law, and family pride. We've come far from those days. Or have we? Modern life wraps our intimacy in layers of passwords, curtains, closed doors. Yet surveillance creeps ever closer through screens, through apps, through data collected in silence. We share willingly, compulsively pieces of ourselves once kept sacred. Likes and swipes replace oaths and trials, but the hunger to watch, to judge, to shame remains. The tools change. The impulses do not. Odd, isn't it, how history circles back? How the desire to control, to expose, to punish lives on in new forms. We are no longer led through streets on ropes, but we walk willingly into digital stocks, inviting eyes upon us with every post, every click, every confession disguised as content. At least today, no one's hanging our sheets from the windows. At least today, our failures aren't recorded in ink to be read centuries hence. At least today, our bodies remain mostly our own. But gratitude comes easier when you remember what came before. When you recall that medieval people weren't prudish, they were obsessed. Obsessed with control, with bodies, with proof, with punishment, with power dressed up as piety. We've traveled from courtrooms of humiliation to medical offices of consent, from witnessed consummation to private honeymoons, from bishop-owned brothels to legal regulated industries, from deadly contraception to safe, reliable choices, from corpse ingredients to dating apps, from rope-leashed adultery runs to sub-tweets and screenshots. Yet beneath it all, one truth endures: people have always wanted love. They've always wanted connection. They've always feared exposure. They've always risked everything to control what feels uncontrollable. The medieval world reminds us what happens when intimacy belongs not to individuals, but to institutions. When privacy is a luxury, not a right. When your body is evidence, not autonomy. And though we flatter ourselves with progress, the echoes remain. In every whisper, in every watchful eye, in every scandal that feeds the public hunger for shame. So sleep tonight knowing this: whatever your secrets, whatever your fears, whatever your regrets, at least you're not being dragged naked through the streets at dawn, holding a rope beneath a sky that never seems to forgive. And so, as we let this strange and terrible history slip behind us like a heavy velvet curtain, let your thoughts grow softer, slower, heavier with the weight of sleep. Let the harsh echoes of bells and jeers fade into a gentle hum in the distance, where they can no longer reach you. Tonight you are far from medieval courtyards and candlelit chambers where strangers judged the shape of your life. You are far from ropes, from ledgers, from herbs steeped in secrecy. You are far from a world where even your quietest moments belonged to others. What belongs to you now is peace, a bed where no one watches, a body free from judgment, a heart beating in its own rhythm untouched by the rules of kings or priests or neighbors. Let yourself drift into sleep with gratitude for the privacy you possess, for the quiet you command, for the freedom to close your eyes without fear of waking to shame. Tomorrow is a different world, but tonight belongs only to you. When a medieval woman wanted to avoid pregnancy, her options were limited. And by limited, I mean horrifying. There were no neat little pills, no discreet clinics, no helpful pamphlets with pastel diagrams explaining fertility windows. There was only desperation. Desperation and a horrifyingly creative collection of methods that ranged from the mildly ineffective to the outright fatal. Contraception in the Middle Ages wasn't just taboo, it was actively condemned. The Church taught that every act of intimacy should be open to life, whether you wanted 12 children or none. Interfering with God's plan could bring spiritual ruin, social shame, or legal consequences. But women as women tend to do found ways. They found ways in herb gardens, apothecary shops, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. They found ways through painful trial and even more painful error. They found ways in the pages of forbidden texts passed from midwife to apprentice, scribed in cramped Latin between recipes for poultices and prayers. These methods weren't soft focus folk remedies. They were dangerous, deadly even. Mercury, lead, copper sulfate. Not ingredients for skincare, but for medieval contraception. Mercury was believed to cool the womb, rendering it inhospitable to life. Small doses were taken as tonics, often disguised in sweet wine. Side effects included tremors, madness, tooth loss, and occasionally death. Lead-based solutions were popular too. They were tastier, referred to poetically as sweet salts, and equally effective at shutting down organs one sip at a time. Women inserted pessaries devices soaked in concoctions of vinegar honey and ground metals. Copper solutions burned, lead ointments scarred. Infection was inevitable, sometimes fatal. Historians still debate whether women understood the risks fully or simply accepted them as the price of survival, and survival wasn't guaranteed. The average medieval woman who made it to menopause had borne between 8 and 12 children. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for young women. Each pregnancy carried the risk of bleeding infection rupture, or just the slow grinding wear on a body already bent under the weight of labor malnutrition and endless expectation. Odd fact, one of the most recommended substances for contraception was crocodile dung. Not just any dung mind you freshly harvested mixed with honey and other herbs and inserted as a pessary. Why crocodile dung? Because ancient Egyptian texts said so, and medieval Europe, for all its disdain of foreign heresies, couldn't resist a good bit of ancient wisdom. Of course, crocodiles being in short supply, substitutes were made horse dung, cow dung, pig dung, none of which helped, all of which harmed. Honey and acacia mixtures fared slightly better. Acacia ferments into acid, providing a primitive form of chemical contraception. Combined with honey's antibacterial properties, these mixtures created a barrier of sorts, effective perhaps, but risky. Non-sterile materials introduced infection. Removal was often more difficult than insertion. Sea sponges soaked in vinegar or wine served as another method. Acidic solutions were believed to kill seed. The sponge created a physical barrier. Wealthy Mediterranean women had access to natural sponges. Their northern counterparts made do with moss rags, even soft bread. Again, infection loomed large. And then there were the animal membranes, early versions of the condom. Sheep intestines, pig bladders, fish bladders. Cleaned, stretched, tied with ribbons. Reusable, expensive, and primarily the domain of men who could afford discretion. The church condemned them outright, calling them armor against God's will. Excommunication was a risk for those caught. Beyond barriers lay potions. Herbal teas brewed from pennyroyal, rue Queen Anne's, lace tansy. All known for their abortifacient properties. All deadly in the wrong dose. Too little did nothing. Too much caused organ failure, seizures, death. Recipes passed hand to hand, 7 seeds of lace chewed daily. Rue tea during menstruation. Tansy infused in wine. And still, women risked it. Because another pregnancy might mean starvation. Another child might mean death. Another mouth to feed might tip the balance from poverty into ruin. The magical methods were no safer. Weasel reproductive organs, mule earwax, menstrual blood charms. These sound absurd now, but in a world where science blurred with superstition, they offered desperate hope. Amulets made from infant hands, preferably unbaptized, were worn against the thigh. Black market trade in such items flourished, feeding accusations of witchcraft. Menstrual blood held peculiar power. Dried, powdered, fed secretly to husbands to dampen their potency. Burnt rags used as pessaries. Blood smeared across doorways to ward off conception. Each method straddled the line between folk magic and proto-science, between hope and horror. Even intimacy itself was manipulated. Some believed that relations during menstruation prevented pregnancy. Others timed acts to moon phases, aligning with astrological charts for maximum effect. Timing, position, frequency, all scrutinized, debated, recorded in grimoires, masquerading as medical texts. And when all else failed, there were the poisons. Mercury again. Lead again. Taken deliberately, knowing the risks, the slow decay of body deemed preferable to another dangerous birth. Skeletons unearthed from medieval cemeteries show telltale signs: lead in the bones, mercury in the teeth. Young women gone too soon, carrying the silent evidence of desperation. Historians still debate how widespread these practices truly were. Records survive in court documents, medical treatises, inquisitorial reports, enough to sketch the outlines of a world where control over fertility was a deadly gamble. Behind the church's condemnation lay female networks of knowledge. Midwives, wise women, prostitutes, nuns. They traded secrets beneath the gaze of laws written by men. They gathered herbs and moonlight-sourced rare ingredients from distant lands, balanced effectiveness against survivability. Persecution followed. Midwives accused of witchcraft often stood trial not for causing harm, but for preventing life. Contraceptive knowledge blurred into accusations of sorcery. Knowing how to stop life was seen as too close to knowing how to end it. One curious survival convents as centers of contraceptive knowledge. Nuns provided medical care to desperate women. They knew what methods failed, which ones killed, which ones offered a slim chance. This quiet rebellion persisted beneath vows of chastity. And yet, despite the risk, despite the horror, women continued. Because the alternative was worse. A body broken by birth. A child buried too soon. A husband unmoved by suffering. A church unmoved by reason. Modern contraception feels miraculous by comparison. Safe, legal, effective. We forget how recent that miracle is. For most of history, preventing pregnancy meant risking death. Every act of family planning played roulette with a loaded gun. And when contraception failed, or love remained unrequited, women turned to other forms of control. Darker forms. The realm of potions, charms, and grave robbing. You might think the church would have stood apart from all this aloof, disapproving, clutching rosaries and muttering about sin behind closed doors. But no. The church wasn't just complicit in medieval sexuality, it was cashing in on it. Quite literally. Imagine your local bishop not only preaching fiery sermons about the dangers of lust on Sunday morning, but reviewing profit margins from his brothels on Monday afternoon. Picture the same man who exhorts you to keep your marriage bed pure, approving the annual hiring fare for prostitutes under his jurisdiction. If it sounds like satire, it isn't. It's history. Let's take a little stroll down to the Liberty of the Clink, a cheerful patch of London just across the Thames from the heart of the city. In this district, some 18 brothels operated under the watchful eye and legal ownership of the Bishop of Winchester. They employed over 1,000 women, so at their peak, colloquially known as the Winchester Geese, not a flattering nickname, but one they carried nonetheless. These weren't secret dens of debauchery tucked into alleyways. They were official, regulated, taxed, and sometimes even advertised with the bishop's coat of arms prominently displayed above the door. You couldn't miss them if you tried. They had price lists. They had working hours. They had inspectors appointed by the church, no less, who verified the cleanliness and health of the workers. Every sin committed within those walls funded the maintenance of Winchester Cathedral. Every whispered prayer, every hymn rising beneath that vaulted ceiling echoed atop a foundation built on the earnings of licensed vice. The hypocrisy boggles the modern mind. But to the medieval church, it was just another revenue stream, like mill taxes, or tolls, or fishing rights. The bishops didn't see themselves as pimps. They saw themselves as stewards of an inevitable evil. Augustine had said so: better to manage sin than let it run wild. Thomas Aquinas agreed. These establishments prevented worse offenses, so the argument went. Assault, adultery, violence. By giving men an outlet, the church preserved public morality. Historians still debate whether bishops genuinely believed this or simply enjoyed the gold that poured in. Likely both. The operations were ruthlessly efficient. Licensing systems ensured every woman had a permit renewed annually for a fee. Sin taxes were paid weekly straight to the church's coffers. Special fees applied for working on holy days. Lent technically was a banned period, but fines could be paid to look the other way. Recruitment fairs masqueraded as domestic servant markets. Young women arrived from the countryside hoping for honest work, only to find the most lucrative opportunities lay beneath the bishop's approving gaze. Church officials assessed candidates like livestock, teeth, hair, complexion, then assigned them to various houses based on perceived desirability. One odd fact: these brothels had retirement schemes. Well, of a sort. Women could buy into funds that promised some financial security in their later years. Few lived long enough to collect. The Bishop of Winchester's model wasn't unique. In Avignon during the papal exile, the Vatican itself ran similar operations with proceeds funding armies and palaces. The buildings still stand, their papal arms carved in stone. German bishops managed chains across the Holy Roman Empire: Cologne, Strasbourg, Mainz. Spanish cathedrals housed brothels within their complexes, linked by underground tunnels so priests could visit discreetly. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't scandalous. It was institutionalized. Priests blessed the establishments. Bishops tallied the profits. Church councils tried half-heartedly to reform the practice, most famously at Constance and Basel, but the efforts failed. Why? Because money. Because power. Because the church needed both. The theology bent itself into knots to justify the arrangement. Brothels were likened to sewers, unpleasant, but necessary for the health of the city. Better a regulated vice than chaos. The logic is laughable now. It was deadly serious then. Records survive in painful detail. Weekly earnings logged in careful script. Health inspections noted with bureaucratic precision. Women passed or failed stamped accordingly. Those who failed disease, injury, age were banned, unless of course they paid extra. Bribes flowed like communion wine. Protection services added another layer of profit. The bishop's guards patrolled the districts, ensuring no violence disturbed the revenue stream. They collected debts, broke legs when necessary, maintained order with ecclesiastical efficiency. Think less holy men, more mafia dons in robes. Even retirement, such as it was, offered no escape. Few women lived past 40. Disease, violence, childbirth, these culled the ranks swiftly. Those who survived often ended their days within convent walls, where their tithes purchased forgiveness in the form of silent prayers and cold stone beds. The church's involvement went beyond ownership. It shaped public perception. It drew the lines between respectable women and those who weren't. Dress codes marked the fallen, specific colors, badges, hairstyles. Society accepted these markers without question. Your status was visible at 50 paces. This wasn't just commerce. It was control. By regulating vice, the church regulated desire, and by regulating desire, it regulated people. Where you could go, whom you could speak to, what you could wear, it all fell under their gaze. Modern scandals pale beside this. Today's disgraced preacher caught in a tawdry affair at least pretends surprise when caught. Medieval bishops hung their banners over brothels and counted coins without shame. And yet beneath this staggering hypocrisy, another contradiction festered. Because while bishops profited from sin, doctors were prescribing satisfaction as medicine. And if you think the church's business ventures were bizarre, wait until you hear what medieval medicine had to say about the bedroom.